this quote from Charles Spurgeon. I just was shown this today, and he said, discernment is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It is knowing the difference between right and almost right. This is where we're at. If you were to fly an airplane from Los Angeles intending to go to New York, but we're off by only 3 degrees in your course calculation, you'd land in Boston, instead of New York.
Welcome back to Restored Gospel Podcast. We are 3 friends today discussing the Tale of Two Zions. This is part 2. Shane Robinson and Corey Stark. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Corey, just open us up. Tell us just a real refresher. What is this Tale of Two Zion? And then we'll go from there.
Well, we're talking about the fact that in the restoration, the collective restoration, LDS, RLDS, there's a story we tell about Zion. It's something we hope for, something we look forward to. But what we've been told is a different story than what the Book of Mormon tells. And I hope to use today's episode to continue this discussion to point out what it is that the Book of Mormon actually teaches. And there's a good quote. I don't know if you got the screen shared, Mike, but I think I've got the presenter view shared. Yeah, so this Tale of Two Zions, this is where we're at. But what I wanted to share was this quote from Charles Spurgeon. I just was shown this today, and he said, discernment is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It is knowing the difference between right and almost right. And I think that's interesting because, this is where we're at. If you were to fly an airplane from Los Angeles intending to go to New York, but we're off by only 3 degrees in your course calculation, you'd land in Boston, instead of New York by the time you get to the other side of the country. And these little differences, they might not seem significant, but they are. And I've just learned it all comes back to, 2 things. One is we got to be able to trust Jesus' word, what he said, nothing more and nothing less. I believe that's what the Book of Mormon says. And also to mix in the history of the more recent church. Joseph Smith was told translating the Book of Mormon would be his only gift, and that was changed later to say one of his many gifts. If the former is true, then I believe that means we could trust the Book of Mormon, but we're also free to question some of the things that came after it. So that's what I want to do, is compare what came after it, what was before it, and go from there. So this, I want to start with a question. What list is this? And this is a list, probably terms you've heard: Melchizedek priesthood, a gathering of the Gentiles in the last days to build Zion, Enoch city. Enoch city was taken to heaven, will return to earth. The everlasting covenant with Zion, as Enoch city returns. And then Zion is on earth for 1,000 years and the millennium. Just, that sounds like, I'm not going to make you answer the question, but it sounds like a list of things we talk about at church often, or we hear talked about anyhow. And it's really something prominent since the days of Kirtland. But the answer to the question, what list is this, is actually this. This is a list of ideas that are not in the Book of Mormon. Okay. So in other words, the Melchizedek priesthood is not mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Enoch city is not mentioned in the Book of Mormon. That it was on the earth at one time and taken to heaven, that's not mentioned. That the Gentiles are going to gather and build Zion. I mean, that's the staple of going to most restoration branches these days. If it's a fundamental branch, anyhow, that's where the conversation is. How are we going to build Zion? Or it's asking the question, when will Enoch city return? And so none of these ideas come from the Book of Mormon. And I just want to spell that out up front, because if you try to consider what the Book of Mormon teaches in light of the paradigm that we've all grown up with, your head will spin. And this is the conflict, the traditions that are taught and told by the restored church versus what the Book of Mormon teaches. So to get in a little deeper into this, the traditional story is that the saints are going to gather and there's going to be this 1,000 years, and Enoch's coming, and this heavenly city, and a physical Zion. But the truth of what the Book of Mormon teaches about these things is that, for instance, we teach the saints will be gathered in one place. The Book of Mormon actually mentions the saints will be throughout the earth, and I'll share a scripture with that later. The the traditional story spells out on the calendar 1,000 years, when Zion is here. The Book of Mormon never mentions the 1,000 years, and you shared that previously, Shane. Maybe there's more you want to expand on that, but you know, the traditional story always centers around Enoch and whatever Enoch did. But in the Book of Mormon, Enoch's never mentioned. His name does not ever occur. And the fact that there was a heavenly city that was the beginning of Zion, the Book of Mormon never mentions that there was a physical city that was taken up to heaven. It's not part of the story. So when we see these things, this guy Enoch, he becomes this legend, and he was really like, it's the stuff Indiana Jones is made of. A bunch of slides I won't share today had to do with some of the history of other groups and what they believed about Enoch. But he was flying up to the heavens. He was going down to the center of the earth. He was finding special records that he brought to mankind, and all these stories of his. Again, the Book of Mormon, all these things he was said to have done and said that we talk about as a church, and especially an everlasting covenant with Enoch. I'm going to drill into that a little bit. The Book of Mormon never mentions any of this. And 1,000 years, millennium with Enoch, it's never mentioned. And I don't want to state that, okay, if it's not in the Book of Mormon, it's not true. And you could find a lot of good examples of that. I think we mentioned last time, like Daniel, for instance. He's never mentioned in the Book of Mormon, but he existed. So, you could say, okay, well, then none of it's true. Well, you have to back up, though, and consider that there were a few people, some prominent people, who did talk about the creation of the earth. And Mormon mentions it. Ether and Moroni, they mention it. It's mentioned by Lehi. But these people, one would consider, if something like Enoch was going to be so important and so prevalent in the last days, that perhaps they would have mentioned it. It seems likely. I can't say, it's just speculation on my part. But the fact there's never a mention of it, it just makes it suspicious, I guess. So, and I'm not on a Joseph Smith witch hunt here, but what's interesting to me is that in the time when Enoch became prevalent in the church in the early 1830s, the Masons were making a big deal about Enoch, and this is just simply a cover of a book that comes from Freemasonry, where Enoch's the big guy here, and this is from the Square magazine. It's a Freemasonry publication. He was a big deal maybe even 100 years before the church was restored in the 1830s. So they've been talking about him for a long time. There are several books. The Royal Arch of Enoch. Yeah, there's one. There's even a Enoch Lodge near you. It's in Dallas, Fort Worth. Shane, you might want to go check that one out sometime. But
Is that where we have?
the Pillars of Enoch. There's Enoch has been a big deal among the Masons forever, and you guys may have discussed this in other podcasts. But the fact is that Enoch was written in a lot of literature, the Kabbalistic literature, which was kind of the Jewish mysticism, Coptic literature, which is really Egyptian Christianity. That's where we get a document called the Kebra Nagast. I'll say a little bit about that later. The Apocrypha, those were books that were removed. They were never part of the biblical canon, but to some they were considered scripture. There were several orders, not just Freemasonry. But the thing was, the Enoch stories were never contained in the Hebrew Old Testament. There was just a mention that Enoch, and sometimes his name was actually spelled with an H, Henoch, Henoch, but was a name was mentioned in the Book of Mormon. But all these stories seem to be embellished after or outside of the Bible. The Jews themselves didn't really hold, as far as the original writers, to any of these stories about Enoch. They were all things that were added centuries and even millennium later. There were a few other orders. The names don't matter, but in addition to the Freemasons, this Rosicrucian order, they were a group in Europe, a secret brotherhood. They mention Enoch in their writings. the Theosophical Society, and that was in the later 1800s, even after Joseph Smith's day, continuing to talk about Enoch. Of course, the Masonic lodges, starting back in the 1700s with the Scottish Rite, and the spiritual movement. People who are mediums. These people had a connection to Enoch. So it's not like Enoch just came to the restored church. Again, he was a staple of the Freemasons, but they even looked at a different side of him. They even considered there was a godly versus a satanic side. And when you start diving deep into this stuff on Enoch, if you're going to believe any of it, maybe you should believe all of it. And if you believe all of it, you have to realize there was a lot of bad things done and said by these people who wrote about him and about him. And it's hard to do what we've done and just slice out this little view of him and decide, okay, well, somehow he was good and righteous, and he's going to bring a city back to earth. Eh, It's a story we tell. That's all I can say. I won't get into it, but this Order of Melchizedek, this book cover, I believe I've got the right one, was something that was part of the original Freemasonry writing. So these ideas that we hold on to, thinking that we're blessed to have them, you know, they they aren't all what we think they are. I'll just say
Hey,
that.
Corey, I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, go ahead, please.
Remember where you're going. I got two things I don't want to forget. I want to circle back to your Spurgeon quote at the beginning,
Okay.
and two, to point out I was one, I have been one, and I've still never studied this, that people would bring up Joseph and the Masons, and I would just wave my hand away, and like I don't have time to listen to that. After some study and different things, I've come to it's really hard to think, how does this affect our church culture? But it really is true that what I've seen is when I thought Joseph was giving revelations directly from heaven, we were getting enlightenment and new ideas and things in the living prophet, and I thought, man, these are interesting. These are nowhere else. But what I'm seeing now is a lot of these revelations that we thought were so unique and we're setting up different things in the church. He was just riffing off of ideas that were present in the culture at the time, whether it be levels of heaven or an Aaronic and Melchizedek priesthood or a school of the prophets or Enoch City. These were cultural things going on, and now you can see Hiram Smith's religious studies class at the University of Dartmouth when he went there. You can see the topics of the studies that he was 2 hours a day in classes, and all of these topics were being talked about. So it wasn't these brand new ideas that all of a sudden came as revelation and became doctrine and became part of the church. How we function, how we worship, what we study, the topics we study, how do they get implemented into building a Zion and a holy city? These were cultural thoughts at the time. And then these revelations came, and so we read them years later and like, wow. But at the time, these were all ideas, and all of a sudden, it's like Joseph's giving revelation, but he's riffing off of questions and different ideas of the day. So I think that's an important mindset to remember, that these weren't brand spanking new ideas out of nowhere, but they were probably topics around the dinner table and things like that of the day. Definitely in religious studies at universities, these things were all being addressed and studied out.
Definitely. Hiram was already a Freemason at the time when Joseph Smith was engaged in translating and bringing forth the Book of Mormon. And so were many of the men influential in Joseph's life, like the man who did the surgery on his leg. He was a Freemason. The the scholars of the day were all Freemasons, and there wasn't anything necessarily bad associated with it. In fact, it was considered sort of an elite group. Even George Washington, the president, had been a Mason. And so there we've got a little different view of it these days. But to give you an example too of something you mentioned regarding revelations coming from the current discussions of the day, David Whitmer writes about this, as well as Brigham Young, that when this revelation we call section 86, or the word of wisdom, came forth, the context of that was this school of prophets was meeting, and the men who were coming to this group were just men of the prairie that day, and they didn't think anything about drinking or chewing tobacco and spitting the juice out on the floor. And apparently, I guess Emma was like cleaning and tidying up the place when these men were spitting their tobacco juice on the floor and said something about, Yeah, Joseph ought to, and she was trying to reprimand the men that Joseph ought to come up with a revelation about chewing tobacco, and it was something to this effect. And then someone snapped back because they knew Emma was a tea drinker, and they said, and yeah, he should include something about drinking tea and coffee in that as well. And it was like this little joke going back and forth. David Whitmer writes about this, and and then lo and behold, it was literally the next day, according to the records, that Joseph has this revelation from heaven. And in that day, there was a man, and his name escapes me. I just was reading him the other day, who was of one of the foremost theologians in the day, who was advocating vegetarianism and abstaining from meat, and the words that he uses as counsel follow the pattern of what the Book of Mormon teaches. He advocated eating no meat, but then it became eat meat sparingly, and he was against drinking, when there were people in the day back, in Joseph's day, who were well-known ministers, who were also drunks because they just consumed so much alcohol. And this was the day he was living in, and these were the ideas he was fighting against. But very much to your point, they were the current topics of the day, and we're so far removed from them now, a couple hundred years later. We just think there were these golden edicts that came from heaven, and it wasn't really that way at all.
Yeah, I read some stuff about the word of wisdom in relation to beer. Joseph actually did drink beer.
Yeah, it's
Um,
recorded in church history, but it was
yeah,
removed too.
yeah. So the beer he drank it was barley based, and it was real low alcohol, and they did that because of water. The water, is hard to get clean water.
Hmm.
And so they would ferment it, have a real mild beer, and that would keep it from, spoiling or whatever, or being dangerous. But I often wonder. I mean, I don't have any proof of this, but I often wonder if, in Section 86, when it talks about barley, if he's talking about those mild barley drinks, but then we apply alcohol to it and say, oh, no alcohol whatsoever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's in the church history too. Again, we kind of whitewash it and only read what we want to read, but that's exactly what it is. Mike, was there something else you wanted to say about the Spurgeon comment?
Just as we go through these things, that Spurgeon quote about the difference between truth and almost truth, right, is just discerning. That's what's important. And so I think it ties back to people that have had questions and say things like, well, what is the big deal about believing in a holy city that's coming back? I mean, we do all believe that we'll be with Jesus, here on the earth at some point in time, and whether it's, we call it Zion, and we're supposed to build it and things like that. Why is it, that important to look at whether it was really a thing or not? And I think that's what you started talking about at the beginning. As we go through these things, we had a listener say, well, I've always had hope. Enoch City's given me hope.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I don't know that I would agree with that. It's given me discouragement through the years, as we continually are told we don't, we're not doing right in the Lord's eyes. We're not building Zion, and it's waiting on us to get our act together and be one, and all of these things. That causes the opposite of hope in me. But so I think there is, well, I would say, what do you guys think? I mean, maybe we'll get to it in a bit, but why is this important to even get the story right? Truth has always got to be paramount and number one, and truth has its own effects on our lives and our hearts and our relationship with God. So even believing a falsehood can give you hope for a while, but eventually it's going to run its course, and you're left with despair. And we see that all the time with people coming to realize, things about the religion they've been part of, where they lose hope for a while. Some of them permanently, others find and refocus and figure out what the foundation really is, and then they're thriving and having good testimonies. But so anyway, some of the thoughts of why it's important to get the story straight.
Well, I think probably the biggest issue that we're facing, especially those of us that grew up in the Restoration in one form or another, LDS or RLDS or one of the others, it is what Joseph really did, what the early church really did, was redefine words. So when you talk about Zion, we all get an idea in our heads what that means. The Bible and the Book of Mormon it's a different picture if you just isolate it and take our filters off. And you can really do that with almost every term, endowment, baptism, eternal life, the life after death. I mean, all these things come with the baggage of what we have kind of wrapped around what was a basic truth that we've made complicated. Like, for example, priesthood. We know that there are elders, priests, and teachers in the Book of Mormon, right? But when we think elder or we think priest, we have a list of duties that they do, and it's a title, and it's lifelong, and it's for eternity, and they stand in the stead of Christ. And we sort of created, in our mind, we create this monster, not monster, but this sort of functional position, like you're being knighted, And really, if you look at what it says in the Book of Mormon, these are just, if you're a teacher, you're teaching the people. If you're a priest, you're administering the sacrament. But it's all just service. It's not, and it's, if it's not based on me, it's based on the Spirit within me. And today I might be operating as a priest, serving the Lord and just doing what He asked me to do, but it's not a title that I bear. It's not a, and so we've complicated it by making everything kind of grandstanding everything instead of just humbly following Christ. And I think that is going to be our biggest challenge. Those of us that grew up in the Restoration, is shedding the traditional understanding of all these words and just going back to the real basics of what it actually says.
That's so good, Chad. I'm glad you said that. And that's exactly right. And that's why if we want to have a conversation now, like say on Zion or on priesthood, we've just brought all this baggage into that word. And that's why people say, well, you don't even believe in priesthood. And, it's like, well, maybe I don't believe in the connotation we've given that word and the animal it's become through the last 200 years. No, there's certain things I don't believe in. I don't believe they're the only vessel to heaven, between us and God. But that doesn't mean, like you said, that there wasn't priest, teachers, and elders in the Book of Mormon. It's just what it morphed into is what we're discussing, not that there's some type of existence of servants of God, right? And so then you're fighting against the word and the definition, not the idea. And I think that's where we're at with Zion. We all believe we're going to be with Jesus someday, and He's going to return, and that's going to be a great time, and there's no crime, and we'll all be loving one another. All the stories, those are true, but it's the connotation and the things we've given to that word Zion that affects our worship. It affects our classes. It affects our focus. It affects our emails and our culture on what we're supposed to be about. And that's where it, I think, gets us off that slight shift. And pretty soon we're missing that intimate relationship with Jesus and focused on something way different.
Yeah, it's amazing if you go back and you look at the history and you read people like David Whitmer and people that have given firsthand accounts of what was going on. Before 1830, before the church was organized, it was really simple. There was 3 branches, just over 100 people, and they were meeting to eat with each other in love, and they had priests, they had elders, they had, the basics that you see in the Book of Mormon, but it was about Jesus. It was about worship. It was about fellowship. That was it. But then as soon as they started to organize, you started seeing all these layers get added on, all these different, like, for example, the apostle wasn't added until 1835. The 70 wasn't added till later. I mean, there's a whole bunch of these things that just got added on to where now it's this massive machine, but if you just get back to the real simple basics of it, it's beautiful, and, I don't know how when you step back from history and you look at it, you say, how in the world do we go from here in 1829 to here in 1844? It seems impossible, but it's because that's how Satan works. One little thing at a time, one little new doctrine, one little new idea. Hey, somebody mentioned something about, caffeine or coffee. We shouldn't drink coffee, or, or somebody mentioned something about Enoch, and so now we layer upon layer upon layer. And what started out as maybe hey, I wonder if, turned into this is the way it is, to where, here you got David Whitmer getting excommunicated for disagreeing, and for not keeping the word of wisdom. How do you go from that? How do you go from this humble worship of Christ and the beautiful, simple Book of Mormon to kicking a guy out of the church and chasing his family out of the area because of his beliefs, because they don't agree with yours. It's I don't know, it's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah. Well, Corey, we really thank you, Corey, for sitting by and being patient. I know you're on. I just thought it's good to establish again, just really hit that why it's important to why this is important, and it's not just trying to pick holes in our history.
Well, what I like is things you guys just shared they tie in with some of the slides I'm going to share, because I think we establish ourselves through our words. I mean, as a human, as a church, as a culture, and words are important, the definitions they carry, because they ultimately help us see eye to eye or not. And this is, I think, ultimately what Jesus does is he redefines, he says, hey, nothing more, nothing less than this. And we have to learn that. We have to obey, we have to respond to that. So my objective here is to simply bring out what are some of the words Jesus says. And maybe we and people listening or watching can become to start to see them in the same way. And that just can only bring us closer to Christ. I believe every group of people that's ever come to Christ, with the Lamanites being the foremost, because we have such a complete example of them, they had to let go of some false traditions. We do that individually when we come to Christ, and that tradition might be sin. All right. But this idea that we have to let go of something in favor of something has always been a fundamental part of coming to Christ at all. So part of that, like I said, comes by redefining our definitions. This idea of Enoch and the Masons, I'm going to let it go here, but even the Masons cast doubt on this. Just FYI, I'm not going to share this video, but it's here in the link if someone wants to find it. But this author goes through and he shows how, hey, Enoch was this fascinating topic, but it wasn't true. And he's a Mason. Okay. So just to let you know, there's people on both sides of this thing. I deleted literally 50 slides that had to do with Enoch and this guy named James Bruce, who discovered this Kebra Nagast and how he brought it out of Ethiopia. And it was around before Joseph Smith's day. Most theologians think it was translated into English in the 1900s. In fact, I was taken by that, and I started saying, hey, look at this great document that wasn't in English in Joseph's day, and look how closely it is to the Enoch story in the inspired version, Genesis 9. Well, come to find out, it was available, and lo and behold, it wasn't just available, it was available through the Scottish Rite of the Freemasonry, and it came into Freemasonry, and you start putting two and two together, and the people who were an influence in Joseph's life, and lo and behold, then you have another revelation. I'm not going to say that it's word for word what Enoch's story is. There's just similarities, and it raises questions. But when he, this is kind of what we've already said, when Joseph Smith includes Enoch, they really didn't know what they had in the Book of Mormon already. I think they viewed it more as, hey, God brought light and truth to the world in these gold plates that Joe has. Hey, well, there's new light and truth coming from Scotland, from the Scottish Rite, and all these things. And I think Joseph was probably a young but impressionable person, and he was probably influenced by people he thought were wiser. When we see this with Sidney Rigdon and others in his life, and I think they looked at him like, God really used you to be a prophet and seer. Look at this Book of Mormon. It's amazing. It's flawless. So he starts bringing these other things forward. And I believe this is where it comes back to, Joseph, this was your only gift, was to translate the Book of Mormon. Now, I know a lot of people in Restoration would have a hard time with this, but if you consider that could be true, then these other things, they fall into place a little bit easier. So the new information around Joseph seems like it began to influence him. Just my thought. I could be wrong. So the problem that I have with Enoch, and that just to take that as an example of how we teach Zion, is that the Enoch story upstages all the Book of Mormon teachings regarding the covenant with Abraham and the regathering of Israel. Last time, Mike, you shared from memory this Genesis 9, when thy posterity embraces the truth and looks upward, then Zion will look downward. All these words have become what we associate with Zion's return. And like you said, the person who wrote, and said, hey, Enoch brought me comfort, and kind of wanted to call us out on the carpet for for that. I get that. I have a feeling the person really didn't listen to the podcast or watch it very closely by some of their other comments. But the problem is we can be comforted by things that aren't true. And discernment, again, is knowing what is right from what is almost right. So the tradition that we have been taught emphasizes a gathering of us Gentiles who think we're Israel, but the Book of Mormon emphasizes a gathering of the descendants of Israel. This is one of the differences between the tradition and the truth. Who's being gathered, Gentiles or Israel? It's a big difference. So when we talk gathering, everyone is talking about selling their house in Michigan or Ohio and moving to Jackson County. The gathering that Jesus talks about is something much different and larger and worldwide. And it's not just a physical relocation to another house in another county. It's spiritually coming to Christ, and it's spiritually knowing him as a descendant of the seed of Israel and finding God anew, doing that first. That's the gathering.
Well, and I just to,
Yeah.
sorry to cut you off, but
No.
I think that's really profound, because when Jesus left the New World, he said he had other sheep to go visit, and so he visited I think he visited all the lost tribes. He visited all the tribes because they're not lost to him. So when we talk about gathering, I mean, we could be talking about gathering from every corner of the world. I mean, the tip of Africa to Australia to, what I mean? I mean,
Right.
I think our view in the restoration has been so dim. We've just kind of put it right here and, right in the Independence area and said, there's going to be, maybe 100,000 people or whatever, eventually all gathered, huddled together in safety. But this is a worldwide event. And this is going to be a massive show of his love for his people. And that was one of the purposes of the Book of Mormon, was to show his covenant people that they are not lost, that they are his, so.
Exactly. So gathering becomes one of these words that by definition, the Book of Mormon teaches a different definition that we really don't use in our modern lingo. The tradition implies that, the Gentiles build Zion and the world falls into it. They kind of have to join our church, if you will. But the Book of Mormon teaches that this land was Joseph's land, and it's actually the Gentiles who get numbered among them and not the other way around. So, that's another part of this. And that only happens after the Gentiles repent, and that is only after judgment on the Gentiles. This is this rude awakening that is facing us, because I think all these ideas of Zion that we circulate among ourselves from the Enoch story and Enoch's return, they give a false sense of security that somehow everything's well with us. We're just waiting on God to bring Enoch City back, when the Book of Mormon has been telling something different all along. And it's not that story. It's a story of judgment, God's fierce judgment, because we did the same that the Jews and the Lamanites and the Nephites did, as we rejected God. And that's what he revealed to us through the Book of Mormon. The tradition, again, like I said, if you try to figure this out through the paradigm of our tradition, it'll make your head spin. It's these traditions that make us feel comfortable, but they blind us to the truth in the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon was what was given so we wouldn't stumble. There's a tradition that teaches that when Zion begins, I use this term Zion begins, that's just how we speak it, then the work is done. It's kind of like, we've arrived. And all we have to look forward to is Enoch City coming down, and then everything's good from there. The Book of Mormon really never says anything like that. In fact, it's the other way around. When the Book of Mormon teaches that day begins, the work begins. That's when Jesus is here and everyone rolls up their sleeves and they work with all their mights for God. So it's a day of work, not a day of rest.
That's a huge one right there. That's just a huge truth that I never never realized, and was completely absent from the timeline that I knew about. But what a hopeful part of the story that is, if we talk about hope, of Christ being here working with us to bring about these last events, not us doing it all so that he can come back. And
exactly. It's a totally different way of looking at it. And again, it's really done by the definition of the words, right? Gathering versus, the work, the day of Zion. This day of Zion isn't something that the Book of Mormon ever even refers to. That it's it's called the days of Christ. That term only appears once actually in the Book of Mormon. You'd think something as simple as that would be everywhere, but it's not in the Bible. It's not in the Doctrine and Covenants, but it's in the Book of Ether, where Moroni is writing. He says, Ether saw the days of Christ, this time when Jesus is in our midst. And that's really the summation of what we think Zion is, but what it is in actuality is when Jesus is here in the flesh, working among us to restore the truth to his people. So the Book of Mormon emphasizes a gathering through the covenant made with Abraham. It's never talked about the covenant with Abraham. Everything gets upstaged by this supposed covenant with Enoch. The covenant with Abraham, which I want to go into in more detail here today, it's about the Jews and the remnant being regathered in Christ. The covenant with Abraham is also about a blessing on the Gentiles. It's Jews and Gentiles because his children were Jewish and Gentile. But again, we have this idea that the Gentiles are going to build a city, and when that spiritual city matches up with the physical city at the beginning of this millennium, all these words don't exist in the Book of Mormon, then we've arrived. And the Book of Mormon doesn't teach any of that. So we've promoted ourselves as God's right hand as the Gentile church. But again, it's a dichotomy because we're told we need to repent for rejecting God as he was revealed in the Book of Mormon. And that's the root awakening. I'm going to jump ahead here. I made a little timeline, and this it's probably worth saying that the traditional story never includes judgment on the Gentiles, but that's really what creates the pivot point in this whole story. I just threw a few little pictures up here. Maybe they help you, maybe they don't. Don't worry about them if you don't like them. But the Book of Mormon tells a timeline that starts back with the Jews rejecting the gospel and the remnant of Joseph. When I say remnant, I'm not talking about any Gentile group. I'm talking about the Nephites, the Lamanites who lived in this land, the seed of Joseph. They in different ways at different times rejected the gospel, which means to reject Christ. That's all it means. And God saw the Gentiles stumbling, and so the Gentiles received the gospel. And how do they receive it? Not by Christ in person, but they receive it by a set of plates that were translated by a boy who didn't understand the language. But the Book of Mormon predicts, and in time it happens, and it's happening right now, the Gentiles reject that very gospel. Okay, so these plates that were given to us with truth, it comes with God's Spirit. Just read it. That's all you have to do. They reject it, but the story doesn't end there. The Book of Mormon promises that after the Gentiles reject the gospel, then that very record that was rejected by them goes back to the remnant who are on this land of Joseph, and it also goes to the Jews, even the ones who are the most stubborn, right? And so it's kind of like we have our chance with it now, but there's going to be a day when we had our chance. And then it goes back to the remnant because God has not forgotten his covenant with Abraham. And this is important because this is all part of the covenant with Abraham. So the remnant builds a city with repentant Gentiles assisting, but it's the house of Joseph who does this. It's all explained in Ether 6 or LDS Ether 13. And these are what's called the days of Christ. And God dwells with Jesus, with man as Jesus. Okay. And the work begins to restore the remnant of Joseph, the scattered of Israel, the Jews. This is explained through the parable of the olive tree. That's cutting off the bad branches of that the wild trees brought in and the bad fruit they produced, and restoring it with good fruit. And the good fruit comes by the word, this word of Jesus that comes to these people. When the trees are grafted together again, it's literally the words of the Nephites going to the Jews, the words of the Jews going to the Nephites. And what they're removing is the contribution of the wild branches, which represent us, the Gentiles. Every branch brought forth fruit, and the master tastes of it and says, none of it's good. And so he's ready to cut the trees down. But what they end up doing is, as the good grows, they remove a little bit of the bad. And ultimately, what is the bad that's being removed? It's the traditions of the Gentiles. I'm going to say it again. What is the bad being removed? It's the traditions of the Gentiles, the influence we had on the church. And you can look around at every group of Christianity and you can see some improper tradition. We have them in the RLDS side. The LDS has their list. They're pretty obvious, but not even within the Restoration. You can look at Catholics, you can look at Protestants, evangelicals, you can look at Seventh-day Adventists. They all hold to certain things that have become their traditions because someone convinced them it was true by taking a scripture and twisting it a little bit. That's why you have babies being baptized and things like this. Gentiles are notorious for wrapping their own traditions in with the truth. The Book of Mormon is the one book that came free from tradition. All right. It gave us straight, plain, simple words to read. And yet we quickly put that on the shelf and brought in our own traditions like Enoch, Enoch City, a covenant with Enoch, all these things. So, anyhow, this remnant builds a city. The Gentiles who were repentant assist, not the other way around. Jesus is in their midst. These are the days of Christ, and God is dwelling with man as Jesus, and there is work going on. The work is to restore the remnant of Joseph, the scattered Israel, the Jews, return them to Christ. And this work also means that the remnant of Joseph on this land builds a city called the New Jerusalem, and the Jews of Israel, they rebuild the Old Jerusalem, and they both become holy cities. I don't know how far in the future this is. It certainly hasn't happened yet. There was no way this was going to happen in the short span of Joseph Smith's life. The people were misguided thinking they were about to build Zion, and we're misguided if we think that somehow, oh, they were so close. What was their one little mistake they made? And let's fix that, and then we'll have Zion now. Many, many things were prophesied back then that still have yet to come to pass. And this is one of them. But the remnant of Joseph are the ones who build the city. And we've got a whole lot of people gathered here in Independence who don't see that truth from the Book of Mormon. We've made other mistakes too. We've called ourselves the remnant of Israel and called ourselves Ephraim, and it's not that. It isn't.
You know what's interesting? An interesting thought. If you could roll back the clock to 1829, and none of the new things got introduced, just kept it just simple. The Book of Mormon, serving Christ and loving one another. What would it look like today?
No kidding.
I mean, the doctrine, we would have a real firm grasp on the doctrine. All the Hebrew poetry and all the things that have been discovered, as we've dug into these things, would have been discovered probably long ago.
Yes.
And I don't think we'd have near the contention or the confusion or the, holding up men that we have now. It kind of makes me sad when I think about what it could have been,
I think we certainly have a much firmer grasp on world events, what's going on in Israel. I think there would be a lot of hope produced as we see the regathering of the Jews. And we would probably, if that spirit stayed with the church, we would have a huge leg up on understanding world events and prophecy because of the Book of Mormon. Now I watch what I would call Gentile teachers that have maybe 70% of the story right, but they understand the Jews' part and they're teaching it without the Book of Mormon, and so they're still missing pieces, but coming much closer in understanding what God is about, what He's shortly going to be about, and what's happening, and with His people.
Yeah.
We're not masters of that story at all. We are. I myself and the culture I grew up in are very. Other than individuals that make it a priority, are very ignorant to the main world landscape of Christ's mission for all of His covenant people.
Yeah, and the people who do try to make it a priority, they're just considered these enigmas, these anomalies that don't really fit into the culture, and because the language of the culture is so different, and that's kind of the frustration here, is that we've drifted away from what the language of it is. Yeah, I wonder too what the church would have looked like if we had just done what we were supposed to do. We may have actually seen the Lamanites return, but part of the prophecy of the Book of Mormon is that the Lamanites wouldn't return until after their scattering was complete. And if you just consider the work of Indian reservations, that started in the 1830s in Joseph Smith's day. That didn't really complete until the 1930s. So there was over 100 years of sub-scattering of Joseph's remnant on this land. And maybe other things in other countries too. I don't know, but so we see these timelines of God. He's not beholden to us. He's not going to make something happen just because a bunch of people thought it was supposed to happen. In the 1800s, a lot of things were supposed to unfold. But the other thing I've noticed is that we when we tell these stories, we get into this Enoch paradigm, and these other details don't fit. Joseph building up a city, that doesn't get discussed. Old Jerusalem being rebuilt again, that doesn't get discussed. It's like we just kind of wave our hands and say, oh, well, that must happen sometime during the millennium, or whatever. But we don't focus on the details. But they were the details that God gave his writers of the Book of Mormon to focus on, and yet we don't understand them. So just it's kind of a mess. But again, maybe we just start by redefining the words. But these two cities are rebuilt. We have an old Jerusalem being built back up. And just to take that for a minute, what's interesting to me is this is all described in Ether 6 or LDS Ether 13. And this chapter starts out something we read last time, that when the water receded off this land, it became the choice land. It's never mentioned there, that it doesn't say, and that's where Enoch City was until it was taken from heaven because they became so righteous. When we look at how these cities are named, the New Jerusalem is because it's new. And then it says, and the old Jerusalem is going to be built up again. But then it goes on to say something interesting, which is this: but it couldn't be a new Jerusalem because it already was once. In other words, it existed once as the old Jerusalem. So they'll call it Jerusalem, but they're not going to call it the new Jerusalem because it already existed. Well, that's interesting logic to me, because that in and of itself suggests there was no city of Enoch that was this new Jerusalem or Zion on earth by the name, because then they couldn't have called it New Jerusalem or New Zion or New Enoch City or whatever if there already had been one. And I guess I'm just saying, just by the names they're using proves that there wasn't a Zion on earth that got taken to heaven that was going to come back, because they would name it something different. Anyhow, it might not be a straight connection in everyone else's mind, but to me, I just think it's one of these other things that they didn't mention it because it didn't exist. It wasn't around. It wasn't ever part of the story.
Right. It would have been speaking about rebuilding or reestablishing Enoch City, not Jerusalem. I mean, there was only one covenant prophetic city for the people, and that was Jerusalem.
Exactly. So, over time, the bad olive trees, that stuff is removed and burned. And again, the wild branches were affiliated with Gentiles, right? That's what got grafted in, and it kept the church alive for a while, but eventually all the fruit was bad, all the traditions that got mixed in. But eventually the bad is removed, and the persistence lasts for, it simply says, a long time. And you pointed this out last time, Shane, that the phrase 1,000 years never exists in the Book of Mormon. It just simply says a long time. When the evil returns, the good and bad are separated, and the bad is cast into the fire. And there's a new heaven and a new earth. And in that, it states that the new Jerusalem and the old Jerusalem continue on. And I know I'm not reading it exactly, quoting the exact language, but the implication is that the inhabitants of those cities continue in the new heaven and new earth. And it says their garments are washed in the blood of Jesus, which means they have received judgment. Their sin has been completely removed. And what does that mean? That means that now this holy city of New Jerusalem comes from heaven to earth. So there is a city that comes from heaven to earth, but it comes at the end of this time of the days of Christ. I'm not going to say end of the millennium. That's how I'm programmed. I'm not going to say end of the 1,000 years. That's how I'm programmed. I'm going to say what the Book of Mormon says. At the end of the days of Christ, the world is judged, and the good and the bad are gathered, and they're separated for eternity. But heaven and earth become one, and this holy city of God, now God the Father, not as Jesus Christ, dwells with man, which can only mean that man has been changed to be like him. And this is said of the inhabitants of the old Jerusalem and the inhabitants of the new Jerusalem, which were physical cities, and the rest of the earth too. But the point being that the transformation is complete. The end of Abraham's covenant is salvation. And this is important to see, that salvation isn't just another thing, that the point of the covenant was to bring salvation to all mankind. And that's a beautiful thing. And yet it's lost through our telling of the story, because somehow we just get this idea that, oh, this guy is going to bring his city back as a reward almost for all of us who got to gather early to Independence, Missouri. And it's like all these things just start to sound frail and incomplete when we talk about them in that context. But what we see through the Book of Mormon is that the whole point of God from the beginning was to bring us to salvation so we could be with him again, fully, completely restored to him. And this is the condition of those in eternity. This is the whole point of Abraham's covenant. So, like I said, language has become suspicious. You know, the Melchizedek priesthood, Enoch, this whole Kebra Nagast, it was all suspicious. And the language, you know, became important. You guys mentioned this, and I had a couple slides that kind of bear with what you just said. We say millennium or 1,000 years, and it's interesting. The Book of Mormon never mentions it, but the Doctrine and Covenants does. I've just got 3, and there's probably about 15 places where it mentions 1,000 years. You know, you're going to dwell in righteousness with men 1,000 years. That when the 1,000 years are ended, men begin to deny their God. There shall be my abode; it shall be Zion, which shall come forth out of all the creations which I have made. And for the space of 1,000 years shall the earth rest. We keep getting this phrase 1,000 years, but it's never mentioned in the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon says instead, for instance, from the parable of the olive tree, wherefore I will lay up unto mine own self the fruit for a long time, according to that which I have spoken. And also it says, Satan shall have power over the hearts of the children no more for a long time. Again, Shane, going back to that incredible information you shared last time, do you remember what was that word, or did you have anything more to say on that regarding this idea of long time and how it ties back to the original Bible?
No, not really. The word is chilioi. It's CHILIOOI, I think.
Yeah.
It's Greek. I know that word is also used with the 144,000. So in the Bible, the original Greek was they used the actual number 144, and then they added the chilioi at the end. You know, and so you have it's not an actual number of 144,000. It's like 144 in a whole bunch. You know, it's like it's just a way of saying a whole lot. And you've got like I forgot the religion, salvation,
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Jehovah's Witnesses, yeah.
Yeah.
They say there's going to be exactly 144,000 people that make it into heaven because of that scripture. And again, it's just a translation thing.
Right. Well, it's just interesting to me because the Book of Mormon never gets caught up in the wrong phrases, and so I don't know. It's important to me, I guess, to start thinking it through the way the Book of Mormon teaches it. This is incidental to the conversation, but I just think it's interesting when the Bible gets it wrong. You know, in Acts 2:24, and this is in the inspired version as well as the King James, but it has a statement: when God raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible he should hold in it. John Ellicott, who is a famous theologian, lived after Joseph Smith, but before us in the early 1900s. He says in this, you can find this at Bible Hub in his commentary, that pains of death was a mistranslation, should have been bands of death. And so here's a word that the inspired version continues to promote incorrectly. Now you could ask this question, well, why didn't the inspired version correct this if it was wrong? Yeah, good question. But bands of death never occurs in the Bible. It's not there. But again, it's all through the Book of Mormon. So the Bible gets it wrong and the Book of Mormon gets it right. And yet, I mean, it speaks for itself that these things are, without advertising, they're made true by the Book of Mormon. The wording that it uses ends up being historically and anachronistically correct. And so we say things like when Zion comes, but the Book of Mormon says the days of Christ. Jesus mentions a couple times he will be in our midst. He says the powers of heaven shall come down. Someone could argue, oh, well, that's it right there. That's when Enoch City comes back. Yeah, but it doesn't say that. Powers of heaven can mean a lot of things. Nevertheless, it's the days of Christ when he returns. When Jacob is sharing this in the 3rd chapter, or it's the 5th chapter in the LDS, the Lord of the vineyard labored also with them, and they did obey the commandments of the Lord of the vineyard in all things. These are the days of Christ. This is when we obey, and it's in the work of regathering Israel. That's when the work commences among all these people of the world, and it's a process. We don't know how long. We're not given to know how long. There's no speculation there. It's just something that happens, and in the end, the fruit returns, and the bad fruit is completely removed. So,
That's another real subtle shift.
yeah,
And just imagine if we grew up and our classes and everything we were taught as little kids, that we were looking forward to the days of Christ when Christ returns and we co-labor with him to bring about a great plan. What a wonderful
wow,
creative, what a great story that would be, as opposed to Enoch City returning, because that's right. It's a slight substitution, but imagine if we dove into that and we told the correct story, and what a wonderful thing to look forward to instead of worrying about who's not on their A game that's preventing Zion from being built by us Gentiles. You have this looking forward to the days of Christ when he will be here to guide us and he'll be the engineer. And we're going to co-labor with him to bring about his mighty reconciliation of all of his covenant people back to him, right? With righteousness. That's just a subtle shift, but man,
it's
is that
beautiful. It's beautiful. It's so beautiful the way you said that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it's interesting because really all Satan, that's kind of this is how the Satan works in that all he has to do is distract us a little bit.
Yeah,
You put something out there that seems righteous, it seems good, it's exciting, entertaining. I mean, amazing. It's amazing the whole idea of a city that was, perfect, a whole entire city of people taken into heaven and they're going to return, and how exciting that'll be. We'll fall upon each other's necks and and kiss each other and all that, like scripture says. But the thing is that, Satan doesn't have to get us to actually worship him. He just has to get us to stop worshiping God,
yes.
or he doesn't have to get us to embrace the truth. We just have to, embrace a little bit or part of the truth. And then he slips in those deceptions. It's, it's amazing to me how, this whole process and how easily we've been deceived, and how we've just embraced some of these things and just built them into almost into our DNA, and how when it happens generationally, when you got your great grandparents and your great great grandparents and all saying the same story, truth just it locks in as truth. Even when you've got the simple words of the Book of Mormon right there in front of you your whole life, the traditions seem to have more power, you know?
That's so true, and I'm kinda kicking myself now because I deleted a few of these slides. One of them was part of the Kebra Nagast, which is this Ethiopian document translated into English, but the point it was making was that Zion, this city from heaven that was supposed to come back to us, was supposed to be really sought after more than Christ. It was in so many words saying it was the most important thing. And that's whether we got it from that document or not. I know that we in the latter days haven't made a connection to that document, but that's the emphasis that we've had. It's like that becomes the foremost thing. That becomes the thing we talk about. We rock our kids to sleep at night telling them about how Zion's going to come back, and these ideas have been embedded into us. But like you point out, Mike, it's something much more powerful to think, well, no, the days when Christ returns, this is the real thing the world should look forward to, and that we as a church should be looking forward to. But it hasn't been presented to us that way because it's a subtle shift of words. So we've talked a lot about these things already. The underlying problem is that we've allowed traditions from suspicious sources to confuse our minds. And these ideas have upstaged the truth in the Book of Mormon, and that's the tale of two Zions. So we've also been kind of schooled to accept anything that Joseph Smith said without question. This is one of the issues that this is going to sound judgmental, but really most everyone in the restoration groups is subject to this thought now, because when the restoration groups formed, it was because they believed the RLDS church had apostatized and now had rejected the truth. So what do we do now? We embrace what we believed, our church history, the lessons of our fundamental teachers. We hold on to these things even more tightly, and they became doctrine that now we could not question, and it puts us in a sticky situation now, because you raise a question at all and suddenly you're colored black by all these people of the restoration. And I just mean that to say that you're cast out, you're not accepted, because the restoration's put itself in a situation now where it really can't ask any deep questions. It can't look introspectively at all, and to do that, you're an outcast. But it's pretty apparent Joseph mixed in these ideas that came from other influences around him. I want to say this, that Jesus never mentions Enoch in the Bible or the Book of Mormon. He mentions the covenant with Abraham. We won't have time to get through this scripture, but I don't mind if this becomes a part 3 and we can hit all these scriptures in some detail. But all these scriptures deal with Zion, as we call it Zion, or these days of Christ. But they tell a different story from the traditional church teaching, and I think it's important that we see what they are. What is the covenant of Zion? And this is probably something that we'll just get started on today, and then we'll continue with and get into these other scriptures next time.
I was going to say we're over an hour already. Is this a good place to start next time? What is the covenant with Abraham, and dive into the scriptures of what the true story of the New Jerusalem and things are?
Yeah, I think that is good, because to get into this a little ways, I mean, all these scriptures are important that we look at them, and I don't want to just kind of rush it at the end either.
Exactly.
So I'll just give you a sneak preview. All these people in the Book of Mormon talked about Abraham, and none of them mention Enoch ever, but they all mention Abraham. And so if you would say to anyone in the church, tell me about the covenant with Abraham, well, you'll get the deer in the headlights look, probably. Well, he was this guy who was the father of Ishmael and Isaac. You might get that much out of it. But the thing that Abraham's covenant is it's about regathering Israel. It's about bringing Jews and Gentiles back together. It's about bringing Christ to the world. But it's about all these things that the Book of Mormon teaches about this promise to Joseph and the remnant of Joseph and their role in this. And some of that was lost to the Bible. We have words from Joseph, and we have words about the Abrahamic covenant that aren't found in the Bible. And again, I mean, you can reject the whole Book of Mormon if you want to, I guess. But if you decide that it could possibly be true, you'll find that there's really important things in it specific to this idea of the days of Christ that are not ever talked about in our traditional discussions. And so, like I said, that is probably good wisdom, Mike, that we stop with this, and we'll start with this the next time. And I want to go through, I've got scriptures on what each of these people say, and especially what did Jesus have to say about the Abrahamic covenant, because that's the most revealing probably of scriptures about us and the Gentiles in our day and our role. It's what Jesus had to directly say. It never gets told. It never even fits into the conversation. We don't know how to fit it in. We don't know how to fit Jesus' words about the days of Christ, about his return in, if we tell the Enoch story of Zion. It just doesn't fit. So yeah, I'd be excited to begin here next time.
Anything else from either of you? Shane's like, what's for dinner? No, this has been good. So we'll pick up there with the covenant next time. Corey, take us out.
Yeah, just remember, we're always and only just walking each other home. Thanks.
Be kind. Please be kind. Until next time, God bless.